Next, we'll talk about body planes. A mid-sagittal plane is if the body was divided equally into right and left halves. When I hear mid, like mid-sagittal, I remember straight down the middle. A sagittal plane creates right planes and left planes that are not equal. The key component here is that they're simply parallel to the mid-sagittal plane. Here's a nifty mnemonic device. The sagittal cut creates sides. You're welcome. A frontal or coronal plane creates a ventral and dorsal section. So if the body was cut in a way that the ventral cavity was separated from the dorsal cavity, you would have a frontal or coronal plane. You will see this happen in cranial surgery, and they can make an incision from one ear up over the head to the other ear, much like a headband. Finally, the transverse or horizontal plane is when the body is cut in such a way that there's a superior portion and an inferior portion, much like if you're wearing a belt around your waist. If the body were cut around your belt line, that would be a transverse incision. Every single one of these body planes is relatable to a surgical incision, which we're going to learn more about in each specific specialty. But understanding the planes created will help you understand why the incision is made in the first place. Internally, the body is divided into large spaces. We call these spaces cavities, and within the cavities live our organs. There are two main cavities in the body, and they are the ventral and dorsal cavity. Because you already know what ventral and dorsal mean, you should be able to tell me where what I would find in the ventral cavity versus the dorsal cavity, right? The dorsal cavity is toward the top and back and contains the brain and spinal cord. It is relatively small when compared to the ventral cavity. The ventral cavity is toward the middle and front, and it's comprised of two sections, which are divided by the diaphragm. The diaphragm is inferior to the thoracic cavity, which is home to the heart, lungs, and major vessels. Adversely, the diaphragm is superior to the abdominal pelvic cavity and contains the stomach, most of the intestines, liver, spleen, bladder, and uterus. There's an imaginary line in the abdominal pelvic cavity that divides it into the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity, but they are not really divided from one another like the thoracic cavity is divided from the abdominal pelvic cavity by the diaphragm. When we go to lab this week, you'll see Sally's abdominal pelvic cavity and be able to conceptualize that it's all one big happy cavity. But if we're being specific, the rectum, uterus, and bladder are technically in the pelvic cavity. The abdominal pelvic cavity is divided into 4 quadrants making equal transverse and mid-sagittal planes. Each quadrant can be described using its acronym, but make sure you don't get your R's or your L's or your U's mixed up, because then you'll be incorrect. This is important to the ST because every structure in the abdomen lives in a specific place. And if we're doing surgery on a specific structure, we have to know where it is to anticipate our surgeon's needs. So, I'm going to rattle off the different structures in each quadrant. You're probably going to have to pause and rewind me a few times to get it all. Do it! So, in the right upper quadrant, we've got the liver, the gallbladder, a portion of the transverse and ascending colon, the hepatic flexure of the colon, a portion of the stomach, and a portion of the small intestines. In the right lower quadrant lives the appendix, cecum, a portion of the ascending colon, a portion of the small intestines, the right ovary, and a portion of the uterus in females, the right ureter, and a portion of the urinary bladder. In the left upper quadrant is the pancreas, the spleen, a larger portion of the stomach, portions of the transverse and descending colon, the splenic flexure of the colon, and a portion of the small intestines. Finally, in the left lower quadrant is a portion of the descending colon, the sigmoid colon, the left ovary and a portion of the uterus in females, the left ureter, and a portion of the urinary bladder. I know you're probably starting to get tired of all this, but we're not done yet. We've got quadrants, but that's not quite good enough. So we have abdominal regions too. Ultimately, the quadrants are used more frequently than the regions are because the quadrants are helpful when discussing the different organs. The regions, on the other hand, are paramount in describing precisely where an abdominal hernia can be found. When we talk about hernias in general surgery, you'll soon realize the regions are helpful to you because hernias can be small, and they can be anywhere from the diaphragm to the pelvis. So on your slide, you see that there are 9 regions. If you think about a tic-tac-toe board, let's find these regions and work from the middle square outward. The middlemost square is the umbilical region. This is where the belly button is. Above that is the epigastric region. Below the umbilical region is the hypogastric region. To the right of the umbilical region is the right lumbar region, and opposite that is the left lumbar region. Up and to the right is the right hypochondriac region. In this region, medical terminology is helpful because the word hypochondriac literally means below the cartilage, which in this instance means directly below the ribs. Up and to the left of the umbilical region is the left hypochondriac region. Down and to the right of the umbilical region is the right iliac region, which coincides with the ilium of the pelvis. And the last region is the left iliac region. And just so we're clear, no one ever calls the regions by their acronyms. They always say the whole thing, which is unlike the quadrants where they almost always do use the acronyms. I don't want you walking around saying there's an inguinal hernia in the LIR because no one will know what you're talking about. Okay? Now we're going to cover some abdominal points of reference that are crucial for the surgical team to know because they are anatomical landmarks in the surgeries dealing with that specific anatomy. In no particular order, I've highlighted these 6 landmarks because when you head out to clinical in a few short months, chances are you're going to get started in abdominal surgery, and you're going to hear these terms regularly. So grab your pens and start writing. The triangle of Callot is a space created by the anatomical landmarks near the gallbladder. It is created by the cystic duct, the common hepatic duct, and the inferior border of the liver. Shown here, the cystic duct is on the left side of the picture and is green. The common hepatic duct is also green, and the inferior liver is red tissue. Within this triangle is the great big bright red hepatic artery, damage to which would be disastrous, and so the surgeon identifies this invisible triangle in the middle of surgery prior to dissecting any tissue. Depending on who you get to scrub with in clinical, this tiny triangle comes up as a quiz item all the time. Next is Hasselbeck's triangle. We will cover this big time in general surgery, but it's another potential space in the human body that allows us to use anatomical landmarks to repair inguinal hernias. Its 3 sides are made up of the rectus abdominis muscle, the inguinal ligament, and the inferior epigastric vessels. The trigone of the bladder is another potential space triangle located inside the bladder itself. We'll cover it again in the genitourinary unit, but it's formed by the 2 openings of the ureters and the urethral opening. And again, this is inside the bladder. So the only way you can see the trigone of the bladder is if you're inside the bladder. We'll talk about how we get there next week during minimally invasive surgery. The ligament of Treitz marks the end of the duodenum and the beginning of the jejunum. We will talk extensively about the intestines during our general surgery unit, but this point of reference is so important in bowel surgery because it helps us know which portion of the bowel is diseased or injured. The hepatic and splenic flexures are specific to organs that they take their names from. So, the hepatic flexure is near the liver, and the splenic flexure is near the spleen. These flexures are where the large intestine are, in a sense, anchored to the posterior abdominal wall, so our large intestine isn't all flippy-floppy inside our abdomen. These flexures are very important in large intestine surgery. Next, we're going to cover some skeletal points of reference, but make no mistake, this is just a quick overview, and there's much more ahead in the orthopedic unit in a couple months. A condyle is a large, rounded protrusion at the end of a bone. The condyle articulates with the next bone in the skeleton of a joint. An epicondyle is an additional projection off a condyle. This is where tendons and ligaments attach themselves to bones that enable the skeleton to move. A foramen is an opening in a bone, allowing blood vessels and nerves to travel through, like the foramen magnum in the skull, through which the spinal cord passes. A fossa is a depression in bone, allowing specific tissue to reside there, like the cranial fossa, where there are depressions in the cranial bones that allow the lobes of the brain to reside there, or depressions in the bone like the glenoid fossa in the shoulder, where the humerus meets the scapula to form the shoulder joint. In our bodies, we have two trochanters on each femur. We have a greater trochanter and a lesser trochanter. These are major projections off the femurs that allow hip and back muscles to attach to the femur, and that allows for powerful skeletal movement. You can deduce from their names that the greater trochanter is large and the lesser trochanter is small in comparison. That concludes the video lectures for this unit. Remember, your 321 comment is due Wednesday at 9 a.m. There are detailed instructions available to you on the assignment on the coursework page of Insight NC. As I mentioned before, you should plan to watch this video again and/or reread the information assigned to you. You may need to experiment to figure out which is better for your learning style. You are expected to know this material, and you will be quizzed and tested not only by me, but by future surgeons, preceptors, and other surgical team members. Lastly, we will come to class to discuss your questions and do a few activities, and then we'll head down to the lab to open up Sally's abdomen. Make sure you're dressed accordingly and have your hand scrub done for the day before class starts. See you soon.